You're watching NTV today. My name is Olive Burrows, and it's time to start tweeting and engaging us in conversation. And the topic of today, the hashtag being NTV today, is climate change. And last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the most extensive warning yet on the risk of rising global temperatures. And in order to bring them down to tenable levels, they project that we need to cut down on carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030, as well as have renewable energy provide up to 85% of our global electricity needs by 2050, as well as reduce coal to close to zero. Individually, to meet these targets, they say we need to eat less meat, milk, cheese and butter, and source more locally, more seasonal food locally, while throwing less of it away. They also touched on the cars we drive while encouraging walking or cycling short distances and taking trains and buses instead of airplanes, using video conferencing instead of going on business travel, and using the washing line instead of the tumble dryer. And they say as well as demanding low carbon in every consumer product we buy, and that informs our discussion this morning. Now, I introduced them a bit earlier, but I shall do so again. There is Professor Shem Wandiga from the University of Nairobi, and he's on the far left. Thank you very much for joining us. Next to him is James Oduor of the National Drought Management Authority, and next to James is John Kioli, who, you wear several hats. You're the CEO of the Green Africa Foundation, a member of the National Climate Change Council, and the chair of the Kenya Climate Change Working Group. Thank you for joining us as well. Gentlemen, I know we see a lot of climate change, but maybe we could sort of explain what that means for the people who are watching. And Professor, I'd like to invite you to do that. What is climate change?
Thank you very much. Climate change is a measure over a considerable time, at least 30 years or more, of the parameters that we normally use to measure weather, whether it is temperature or rainfall or sunshine. You get the record over 30 years, and then you sum those records and see over season. A season is of 3 months. You sum over season and see whether the temperature is increasing or decreasing during that season. And when you look at that trend over a long period, then you will be able to come to a conclusion that the climate has changed. And with that change, we now begin to measure what other things are affected, particularly the ecology, the human people, the water availability, and all other parameters. And that is what we are looking at, the interaction of that long trend with us as human beings and with the ecology.
Okay, and I'll bring in Kioli at this point. Now, if we look at the report I made mention of, we've seen a lot of reactions to it. We saw in Paris, for example, there were demonstrations by thousands of people who took to the street over what we call the Paris Agreement, of course, which I would like to invite you to explain exactly what agreement that is and what did the nations, the global nations, sign on to. When Trump came onto the scene, he said the US would no longer abide by their commitments as far as the Paris Climate Change Agreement is concerned. But before we get to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we've heard a lot of numbers being used, well, 1.5 C and then 3C. What do they all mean?
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this very good TV station. 1.5 degrees is a measure that came to pass around 2008, 2009. And this was pushed by mostly small islands, nations like Tuvalu and other nations who thought that by doing 1.5 degrees will limit the emissions of carbon in the air for a period of time. But bringing more meaning to it is that agricultural, economy, tourism sector, is affected by degrees that if they increase, then it affects the sectors. And this was captured under, I want to go into Paris Agreement. In Paris Agreement, Article 2, subsection 1A, talks about all the 196 nations agreeing that they should do the economies in a low carbon pathway, meaning that they will try and decrease the amount of carbon emissions in the atmosphere to 1.5 degrees by 2030. In Kenya, for instance, globally we are responsible for about 0.1 degrees centigrade. And if you look at, if you look at the global 0.1% of the global emissions, if we move the way we are going, which is called business as usual, it means we are going to pump 143 metric carbon dioxide equivalent to the atmosphere. But good thing is the country has said we are going to cut 35% of that emissions by 2030. But we need money to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
Before I come to you, James, and speak to you on why this should matter to us as Kenyans, Professor, there seems to be a lot of chemistry involved. What is this CO2 and why is it bad, bad for us?
Yes, these are small molecules. They are 2, 3, 4 atom molecules, and they accumulate in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is known like we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants during the day use the carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate and make them grow. At night they breathe out oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide, and during the daytime they use carbon dioxide and oxygen and water. So then we have the little molecule called methane. Methane is a gas. Everyone produces a gas. When you pass gas, there's a smell. That smell is methane. Okay, that's the simplest I can put it for anybody to understand. So methane is brought out by fermentation and digestion of carbohydrates, which are the carbon, the food we eat, really. Then we have another gas which is called nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a decomposition of the nitrate which we use as fertilizer. And when the microorganisms work on the fertilizer, they decompose it and produce nitrous oxide. And those are the major greenhouse gases which we are concerned with. And for that reason, we look at them and see how they affect the atmosphere. Simply to say, if you leave your car on the street, on the road, and you close all the windows, and then it is shining, and you come back a few hours later, you'll find that the temperature inside the car is hotter than the temperature outside the car. That simply means that you locked the carbon dioxide, the methane, and the nitrous oxide, and they absorb heat as the sun comes out. Then they radiate that heat in long wavelength, like microwaves. And the microwave, we are cooking with microwave, so we know how microwave cooks food first. So that raises the temperature within the car, and that is the heating of the climate.
Okay, and why are these higher temperatures something we should be concerned about, Kioli? I'm trying to save Oduor from coming in at the technical part because I want him to speak on the impact.
As you may know, we survive at a certain temperature. And our economy as developing countries, we lack so much to survive if our temperature increases. For instance, you are seeing a lot of desertification increasing. This is partly because of climate change. If you look at the coast region, that report that you mentioned, the special report that was released on the 4th of October, talks about if we do not go by 1.5 degrees centigrade, it means the sea level will rise by 10 centimeters. This means that the tourism sector will be affected. This means that those guests we receive as tourists will not have any reason to go to Mombasa. They will have no reason to go to areas of coastal region. This affects so many other things. If the temperature increases, we continue the way we are continuing, it means again that Masai Mara will be no more. As you can see, there's quite a lot of reports that are coming from Masai Mara. It means that there will be no river, no water on that river. There will be no that sense, sensational, of those animals crossing, the wildebeests crossing to the side of Kenya. If you go to agricultural sector, coffee, tea survives at a certain temperature. If it increases, it means that you will not get the yield that you are getting. So these sectors are all affected by increase of certain temperature.
Okay.
Yes.
James, now I'd like you to come in at that point. Yeah. The screens behind us are showing some very scorched, dry earth, and you work for you're the CEO of the National Drought Management Authority. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations released a report just a few weeks ago, which showed that food security has actually declined, and one of the reasons they attribute, one of the things they attribute that to is climate change. You work in the front line. You're like a soldier, and now you're the one. We have the technical expertise, but you're the one who's actually going out in the field and seeing this impact firsthand. What have you witnessed?
Thank you very much. I think climate change is now a reality. The information is in the public domain. We don't doubt all what the scientists are saying, all the research that have been done. It shows that it's here with us. And when it's here with us, for example, in my case, it is very much linked to drought problems. And you can see clearly that droughts are now more frequent. We talk of 1990, 2001, 2005, 2006, 2009, 2011, and the most recent one, 2016, 2018, which shows clearly that nowadays, 1 in every 3 years, we have drought. Before it used to be probably 1 in 5 years. So with now that effect of drought, the negative impacts of climate change are now affecting the various sectors, affecting the livestock, affecting the agriculture, water, health, nutrition, and all this. And at the end of the day, when all these sectors have been affected, finally, it is affecting food security and nutrition. At the moment food security and nutrition is affected, that's where we come in. Now the communities will start suffering, and the other people will start suffering. And the impacts are great because this impacts on the livelihoods, the sources of income of the communities, the sources of food, and all this. So that's a reality, and this is what we are seeing, what is happening. So to me, it is not the issue of whether climate change is there or not, or whether we need more information or not, or whether we are halfway or not. It is, this situation is there. The scientists have done their work. They have given us the information. They have even given us, told us a recommendation on what to do. So for me, it is the action to ensure that we adapt to the climate change and ensure the communities survive with the change.
Okay. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, you said we're having droughts more frequently. Also, is part of the impact that we need to put in more input to get the same output that we were getting previously in terms of, for example, farming. Very many Kenyans subsist on farming. And so now does climate change, for example, mean that we're putting in more fertilizer? We have to put in, more, put in more effort to get the same harvest?
Thank you very much. It means that there are things that we have to do. There are certain things that we have to do differently. And I'll divide this into two. First, there are actions that we have to take when the situation warrants. Like, for example, when drought is there, then we have to act. These are short-term actions to minimize the impacts. to save the livelihoods, to save the lives, and to cushion the communities from suffering. Just for example, we need to have early warning information to enable us take early action when the situation occurs. And we need to ensure that action is taken at the earliest opportunity possible. That's number one. We need to be aware, we need to know it's coming, and when it arrives or when it's there, the actions to be taken. Secondly, there's the issue of contingency planning. Early warning will tell you it is coming, but you have to plan very well to know that when it comes, what am I supposed to do at each stage of drought, where, and in what sector. And that contingency planning also goes with financing. You have to have the cash or the money to respond. For example, on livestock sector, on agriculture sector, health and nutrition, and all this. There are also certain things that we have to do that cushion the communities during drought. They are what we call shock responsive activities, where the government and other stakeholders provide cash to the communities during normal times, but when there's drought, then you upscale that cash so that they could be cushioned. And we also need to have what we are calling financing risk mechanisms, different financing instruments to finance different activities when a drought strikes. So that is one. What do you do so that you deal with it when the problem is there? The secondly is the long term, which actually is the risk reduction. You look at the situation now and you say 20 years to come or 15 years to come. What is it likely to happen? And you do something now so that in the next 20 years, then when it comes, the impacts will be minimized. Right. That is looking ahead and reducing the risk. And this one, maybe I'll explain later, is a lot of long-term sustainable development. It's the issue of poverty reduction. It's the issue of building resilience so that communities can deal with it, reducing vulnerability to enhance the coping mechanisms of the communities. So in short, yes, there are things that we do differently. There are things that we also enhance. So there are so many things to be done. It depends on the sectors. And the long term, but it depends on the sectors, the water guys, the livestock guys, the agriculture guys, and all the other sectors. And I think the various sectors have got their plans. And even for drought management as a whole, we have also got the plans for short term and long term.
Okay, yeah, in fact, I'd like to hear what Kioli has to say about that, being a member of the National Climate Change Council. But first, I'll start with you, Prof. I'll go back to you. And we've heard the most vocal world leader on this issue of climate change has been US President Donald Trump. And initially, he gave the impression that he thought it was a hoax. I think that's quote unquote what it was described as. Now he says he believes that there is climate change. That was in an ABC interview, his very most recent interview. He said he believes there is climate change, but he's not convinced that it's man-made. So, and then he went on to say that it's a political agenda that the scientists are pushing. Are you pushing a political agenda, Professor? And is it a hoax? Is climate change a hoax?
I would have wished it was a hoax, but it isn't. Because those who are feeling the impact of climate change by seeing the disappearance of their islands have no hope of receiving that island back anytime soon. When an island is swallowed by sea level rise, it's gone. Those who are in Kenya, those of us who know the beautiful giraffe, which we love very much, and the fear that giraffe is now endangered, critically endangered, and may not be there in 10, 20, or 50 years from now, puts us at the point where we cannot bring back the giraffe once it is gone. It is a one-way street, and like somebody said, that what is wrong with us human beings, who can put man to the moon, but cannot react to stop climate change. That is how stupid we are, that we are so clever to put a man to the moon, but we cannot take joint action to save the demise of this planet. Now, there is no way that science can play politics. because science reports the reality. I talked about temperature. If you monitor the temperature over Nairobi for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, you have a record. What politics would you bring into that record? Nothing. Now, if you monitor the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for now we have over 200 years monitoring of carbon dioxide. We know where it was when we started monitoring, and we know where it is today. What politics would we bring into that concentration? And what we are saying is that the physics of the atmosphere is such that when the sun radiates the energy, it goes to every part. Some of it is reflected back to the atmosphere by the clouds. Some of it is reflected by the ice. Ice is melting, so that reflection is not going to be coming down. Some come down to the earth, and when it reaches the earth, it is changed to the long wavelengths, the long infrared. And when it goes back to the atmosphere, it meets these greenhouse gases which I described earlier. The greenhouse gases do not let the infrared go back to space. It absorbs that infrared and brings it back again to the earth. And that pumping of the infrared from the ground to the space and back to the ground produces the microwave. The microwave heats the nitrogen, which we have plenty of. It's the most abundant gas, and other gases in the atmosphere. These gases begin to move faster and faster. And as they move faster and faster, they hit one another. And when they hit one another, energy is neither destroyed or lost. They turn into heat. And that is the heat we are talking about. That is bringing up the climate. There is no politics. It is pure science. And for Trump to say that he hopes the earth will come back again and the changes, yes, there have been changes, but they have not been as extreme as what we are experiencing now. And this is the fear we have.
You know, he made a statement to the effect that he thinks it may resolve itself. But we want to hear what you think. I feel like I should have given you a chalkboard and sort of to break down that microwave effect for us. Are you feeling the effects of climate change? Have we lost you? Have you understood what climate change is? And if you farm or you're in an area that's been struck by drought, please share your experiences. And the hashtag, as I said, is NTV Today. The handle is at NTV Kenya. My handle is at Oduor. Gentlemen, are you on Twitter?
Yes.
You are? Okay. What's your handle, John?
Kioli John.
At Kioli John. And no, James, we need to get you
I'm
on
still
Twitter.
analog.
You're still analog. Okay. Professor?
I'm a BBC, born before computers.
I represent them.
You represent them.
Yeah,
okay,
my
so
seniors.
share your thoughts
I'll
today.
get one today.
At Kioli John, yes?
Yes.
Fantastic. Mine is at Oduor, and the NTV handle is at NTV Kenya. Share your thoughts on our conversation on climate change. Now, emissions, Kioli, is a word that we hear time and again. So what are these emissions about? Is it like the exhaust fumes that come from our vehicles when we drive, or are we looking at the industrial age? What are these emissions?
Thank you very much. I'm sure Professor Wandiga had really dwelt on that, and very much being my senior. But to my understanding, it's what we call the greenhouse gases. There are quite a number, and Professor mentioned some, like methane, carbon dioxide, and all these gases, because of the things we do, like the vehicles we drive, the forests we burn, the factories that emit a lot of carbon dioxide, they form a blanket on the atmosphere. And this blanket is what brings the effect of greenhouses, the effect of heating, the effect of global warming. And that is the effect that Professor put across that makes us not to do what we ought to do, because the degrees have increased. But going back to the question that you had earlier asked about what probably the government is doing is quite a number of things. In 2010, the government came up with the National Climate Change Response Strategy that for the first time in Kenya, it gave this, the strategy how the government should move in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change. In 2013, the government again came up with a National Climate Change Action Plan, which was like a work plan of how the government needs to move the low carbon pathway. And then in 2016, I'm happy to have been involved in the Climate Change Act, which was signed by our president. For the first time in Africa, we got the Climate Change Act that is very unique. I think we are second to South Africa. And the government committed to various things. One is it established a Climate Change Council, which is chaired by His Excellency the President, and it has membership from several line ministries like Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Energy, and other sectors. It also has representation of the civil society, which I am, and then also the private sector and indigenous groups and academia. Now, that is one of the seriousness we saw from the president, that actually the country needs to move the low carbon pathway. And that convening power will push this country to the next level. The other thing that is very...
No, but I'd like to come in at that
Yes.
point. But we always form these, what are they called? You know, bodies to sit down and discuss and formulate policy. But practically, I mean, what measures, what steps have been taken to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Under the Paris Agreement, Article 4, it talks about national determined contribution. The country came up with that as a priority, and it came up with several things. One is to increase the uptake or increase the geothermal production. Number two, increase energy efficiency in terms of the sectors like the manufacturing sectors. How can we increase the efficiency? The other thing is to increase tree cover to 10%. The fourth thing is also to look at what clean energy methods can we use, because Kenya is using more than 80% on biomass. So we cannot keep on talking about renewable energy and forget about the bulk that we are using. So there's that effort. Then the other one is also to have, transport systems which can accommodate clean energy systems. And one of them is the SGRs. And I think the government is also planning to put some railway which will be using electricity. And then the other thing that is very key is the issue of solid waste management as a priority for this country. I think this is a sector that has been looked at, and also as an opportunity to produce that methane gas and use it for cooking or producing electricity. So we are looking at climate change also as an opportunity for other sectors.
Okay.
Yes.
James, I'd like to come in at that point, although we'll come back to Professor and John specifically, because to explain why we are being told to throw away less food and why we are being told we should eat less meat. But James, do you farm?
Me?
Yes.
No.
No.
But I deal with the farmers, pastoralists, and the food security activities.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the ground, practically interacting with people,
Yeah.
what are the complaints you hear?
Given the drought-specific issues, because that's what I deal with, I think the complaints majorly is that, as I said earlier, the droughts are frequent. When they occur, they are also prolonged. The areas covered when drought strikes are also widening. Most of the arid and semi-arid, arid areas, semi-arid areas, and even some of the high potential areas. Sometimes when drought is severe, even some of the high potential areas are affected. So the impacts are becoming great, the impacts are becoming severe, very negative impacts. And at the end of the day, those livelihoods are affected negatively. Livelihoods could be somebody's surviving because of crops, the crops are hit. Somebody survives because of livestock, livestock is hit. Or even the urban guys who may be not farming, but they have the money they want to purchase, then the prices of food commodities become very high. So the reality is, on the ground, is that the climate change issues, and particularly how it's affected drought and it affects people, is now being felt in terms of, at the end of the day, it is the issue of food insecurity and nutrition problems. That is the bottom line.
Okay.
Yes.
So what is the mandate of the NDMA where that is concerned? How, what role do you play?
Now, we are a national institution. We are supposed to, on behalf of the government, to take the leadership on how drought management issues should be handled. And we are supposed also to coordinate other stakeholders, so many other stakeholders, to do the job that we are supposed to do. And in this regard, actually, we developed a strategy on ending drought emergencies. The strategy started operating in 2013. We brought in all the stakeholders. It was signed by the county government, national government, development partners, and others on what we are supposed to do, action that we are supposed to take in the next 10 years up to 2022 to minimize the future impacts of drought. And in the activities that we are doing, we are looking at the current problems and how we are resolving them, but we're also looking at the risk reduction, as I said earlier, what will come in the future and how it should be, what we should do now to make sure that in the future, when the drought comes, then the impacts are minimized. So we are not only there as NDMA coordinating, we are there as NDMA taking the leadership in terms of the strategy, in terms of bringing people together so that we can undertake some activities that are drought management, climate adaptation, climate change and adaptation related as we go along so that we minimize the impacts in the future.
Okay. I'd like to press pause on our conversation, but when we come back, as I said, because I want us to cross over to the Milimani law courts where the suspects being arraigned to do with the Rio Olympics debacle. But when we continue this conversation, I'd like us to look at what was discussing, which is the recommendations in terms of the individual actions that people can take. For example, the impact of the food we throw away on climate. Now, our conversation today is on climate change. The hashtag is NTV Today. The handle is at NTV Kenya, at Obarrows, and at Kioli John. I'm joined by two other guests in studio as well. That is James Oduor of the National Drought Management Authority and Professor Shem Wandiga from the University of Nairobi and specifically the Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation. Now, gentlemen, as we bring this conversation to a close, what can we do individually to address climate change? Now, the scientists have pointed out several things which we highlighted at the start of the show, and that includes eating less meat, throwing away less food. How does that affect climate change, Professor?
I would like to look at it broadly and say that, yes, we need to produce less greenhouse gases, but we must not take a general recommendation in doing so. For instance, let me say that the lifestyle of the developed countries is totally different from the lifestyles of those in developing countries. You'd be lucky to find, in average, a Kenyan eating even a quarter of a kilo of beef every day. But that is not the norm in the developed countries. Secondly, I would like to say that we should not confuse the case of looking for a way of reducing greenhouse gases through mechanisms which have been established by bringing in extraneous issues which will keep us worrying. The issue which is at the center of the debate now is that should the government put a limit to how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, and hence when you are producing more, you can be allowed to buy from somebody who is producing less so that you continue producing? Or should the government tax the carbon? In my view, taxation is the best. For instance, in Kenya, we do not have good roads. We do not have a power network that would enable us to use electric cars or electric motor vehicles. Charging them is not there. We cannot run our factories on solar because we have not developed the storage capacity that would store solar energy to enable us to run our factories. And therefore, our solutions are totally different from the solutions that you will find in Europe or America. And for that reason, in my view, the best way, which overrides some of those recommendations, is that we need transport, and we need various transports. There are some people who can afford to drive SUV, but there are some areas where even a small car cannot travel unless you have an SUV. So the only way that the government can help us create demand and resist for using a lot of these gasolines is by taxing the carbon, and that is the fuel tax. The fuel tax will democratize the process of reducing gases than for the government to begin taking the role of the administrator of the atmosphere, which they don't own.
Okay. All right. John, in sort of as we wind up this conversation, what would be your recommendation to the people who are watching at home? You did mention solid waste.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we want to look at this in terms of what has the biggest abatement level, what has the biggest impact in terms of getting this carbon lowered. One of them is to look at how counties are dealing with issues of climate change. One of my biggest recommendations is make sure that climate change is mentioned in the CIDP, the County Integrated Development Plans. Make sure that you put money aside for climate change. Make sure that there is money in the budget and ensure that the projects are done. That will empower the people of this country, because the Climate Change Act 2016 has given the counties a lot of power to deal with climate change issues and also report to the county assemblies every year. Secondly, is the Big Four agenda might be hindered if we do not incorporate issues of climate change. One is the housing sector needs to be weaved into climate change so that the energy that is used there, the systems that are used there, if they do not incorporate the green building standards in the housing sector, then that will have a challenge. Then finally, there is a very great impact on issues of energy. If you look at the capacity of people who can buy electricity, who can pay electricity bills, are still very low. Quite a big chunk of people are using the paraffin lanterns, the nishikie nitandike. So this needs to be wiped out. We need to eradicate paraffin in the next, by 2030. If the government is serious on it, then we can do that and replace it with solar lanterns,
Okay.
which are very cheap, and that is where the impact will be.
Okay. James, I'd like to conclude the conversation with you from the perspective of somebody who is in the front line.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, this is something which need to be tackled in different ways and very many solutions. You cannot tackle it in one way or with only one solution. It's like an army going to war. You need to carry grenades, you need to carry bombs, you need to carry AK-47 and the rest. So what we need here is an integrated approach, so that we have integrated approach so that sectors, intersectoral activities, sectors working together as a team. We need intergovernmental, national government working together as a team. We need interagency working together as a team. And also finally, we need a lot of increased investments in the long-term sustainable development, especially in terms of risk management, looking ahead and doing something now so that in future the negative impacts of climate change can be minimized. Specifically on drought, we are talking of some basics that we have to do before 2022 if you have to minimize the impacts. One.
Okay. I would like to defer that
Okay.
conversation to another day.
Okay.
Definitely we shall continue it. But thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me in having this, I think, a very important discussion in climate change, and which is very broad, so we definitely cannot cover it in one sitting. But I do promise you that we will continue this conversation. Our guests have been Professor Shem Wandiga from the University of Nairobi, Institute of Climate Change and Adaptation, also joined by James Oduor from the National Drought Management Authority, and John Kioli, who wears several hats. He's the CEO of Green Africa Foundation. He's a member of the National Climate Change Council and the chair of the Kenya Climate Change Working Group. Definitely, James, I know you had a lot more to say, especially on drought mitigation, but we will continue that conversation at a later date to allow Dan Mwangi to bring us the very latest from the business desk.